talked a lot on the podcast about some of these lying candidates who ended up getting elected. Of course, there's George Santos, the Republican, now member of Congress from New York's 3rd, who I can't even believe he got away with his lies. They were just like outrageous. And then you had Clyde Shavers, who's a Democrat who was elected to the 10th legislative district in Washington, claimed he was an attorney. He's not. Inflated his military service, which is weird. If you served your country, that's honorable. You don't have to inflate or exaggerate your military service. So there's been this talk about, okay, what can we do if opposition research isn't enough to catch these things early on? If the media is not catching these things early on, what can be done? You might not know that when you get, with your ballot, you get a voter guide. And you have candidates who can write a little bit about themselves and their background, education, work experience in the voter guide. So if you're not familiar with them, you can read that and get to know them a little bit better. You might not know that no one fact checks the voter guide. Candidates just write in it, they could say that they've got a degree from Harvard, Yale, and no one is checking that information. It's contingent on the voters to do that. Well, a former Washington state representative, Chad Magen-Dans, wrote an op-ed for the Seattle Times urging lawmakers to enact a law that would verify candidates' backgrounds for the voter pamphlet. He says this is something that could be done by elections officials. I invited him on the show to talk about it. Chad, welcome to Undivided. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brandy.
You're a teacher, right? What do you teach?
I teach computer science. This is my 4th year teaching in the Bellevue School District.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, good for you. You look very teacher-esque right now.
This is my scruffy season look. Yeah.
I like it. So before we dive into what your proposal is to deal with people who might be inclined to lie or embellish their resume, when you were running for office, what, if any, restrictions were put on you when it came to what you put on the voter guide?
Really nothing. I mean, there was just the word count limit. You could say pretty much anything you wanted. There was no validation of any information that you put on there, even though there were separate sections for your professional experience, your education, your elected experience. They didn't validate that at all, and they still don't.
Were you ever inclined then just to throw a few little sprinkles of falsities in there?
Yeah, there's always the temptation. And I think that George Santos really felt the pressure to kind of, check those intersectionality boxes to kind of lay claim to victim status, whether it's, being Jewish, or I've had people come up to me saying, oh, if only your name was actually Hispanic, it could be Magendez. And that would be a check that you could do on the intersectionality checklist. So there's definitely pressure to do that sort of thing. Personally, I wasn't tempted myself. And especially when it came to things like military service, we veterans take stolen valor very seriously. And so, there was never any temptation to do that.
Yeah. And just for the record, because I imagine that's why one of the reasons the Seattle Times editorial board had you write something on this. Can you talk about your military service quickly?
Sure. I did 12 years in the U.S. Navy. I actually am a nuclear submarine officer. Unlike my Shavers, I got my silver dolphins on the USS Georgia and then my gold dolphins on the Henry M. Jackson.
So let's talk about Clyde Shavers because, with the George Santos thing, I guess I'm very surprised from a journalistic perspective and also just the climate that we're living in where access to information is so easy. I'm surprised a candidate at that level could tell lies that big and not have it figured out pre-election. So I think there was just a lot of shortfalls there. But with races for state representative, am I wrong to think that there should be some level of opposition research that would have caught Clyde Shavers' lies sooner?
There should be. And I've worked in campaigns where that was a priority. It depends on the scale of the campaign. Like when I was running for Senate, we had funding to go do that research, and there were dedicated people that the party would use to do opposition research. And, sometimes you end up with some really, good stuff that you keep in your back pocket and drop when you're ready. When you're running a regular House campaign like mine, I was doing a lot of the work myself. And so I was, maintaining my own website. I was writing, designing my own yard signs, my own literature, my commercials. I was basically a one-man team. And so sometimes you just don't have the time or the staff to be able to do that sort of research. And increasingly, neither do the editorial boards. I mean, we got fewer and fewer editorial boards, and they're stretched so thin. They used to be that they would make that kind of candidate verification part of their process, and they're just not doing it anymore.
Yeah. So talk about what your proposal would be to try to weed out some of the lies that might arise.
So there are those three sections that are part of the voters pamphlet right now: the professional experience, the educational experience, and the elected experience. And it seems like since those are already broken out, those would be relatively easy things to verify, particularly since election officials would have access to the ESD department for professional background. It's easy enough to run a transcript. HR departments do that all the time, and of course you can check with the PDC on elected experience. This is something that the Municipal League did when we did our candidate ratings. They did a partnership with Candidate Verification, a group that was started by David Dowd, and they did exactly that. They verified your resume and actually did a criminal background check as well, which I think is also very important. And it was easy enough so that the King County Municipal League decided that it was going to be a requirement that they made for every single candidate that they were going to evaluate for their candidate ratings. And then McClaskey and like the Tacoma News Tribune, they jumped on board too. And so that was something that was done in 2014 and then kind of petered out. And I'd like to see a more robust version of that come back and kind of make it official as part of the process of submitting your information for the voters pamphlet.
So if you're going to have obviously the government do this, I guess, to do the verification as part of that process, there's going to be questions about, well, who's going to do it for the government? If they're working for a Democrat, are they going to be fair and actually check the backgrounds of Democratic candidates? I guess, so how would you try to account for personal bias in that process as well?
Well, obviously, we can check the process itself. I mean, the parties will do that. They will, basically audit certain candidates that have submitted, and that could be part of your opposition research, is to make sure that the information in the voters pamphlet is accurate and that the election officials are doing their job. But I chose those three categories specifically because they are fairly cut and dry. There's not a lot of interpretation needed to check a transcript.
Yeah, that's very true. And because there are some lies that are embellishments or stretches that are sort of like, do I call this a lie? Do I not call it a lie? And then I would wonder, and maybe this is just too into the weeds or far down to even get into, but part of me, like as a voter, I want to know who did lie, and if
Mhm.
somebody put that they, went to Harvard or something and they didn't, is that something that would be released as part of the process, or would it just be corrected and sent out to voters?
Well, what I was imagining, and again, this process is something we would iterate on with the legislation as we draft the language. But I was expecting that there'd be an opportunity for the candidate to correct the error, okay, and that if they refuse to do that, there would be a disclaimer at the bottom of the pamphlet that basically said we were unable to verify this person's, college degree or work experience or military experience, something like that.
Yeah, I like that. And just to round things out, for Clyde Shavers, a lot of his lies were told, verbally to groups, or they were sent out on campaign mailers, saying he was an environmental attorney.
Mhm.
So I guess I don't, I mean, there's no way to prevent a candidate from speaking lies to people. But when it comes to putting a lie on an official campaign mailer that came from your campaign, is there anything prohibiting that?
There isn't. And if you look at the actual RCW, there's a lot of material out there to protect other people from saying falsehoods about you. Although Times v. Sullivan made that bar very high in a campaign, but you can't do that to yourself. I mean, if you make false statements about yourself, that's not covered under libel or slander, right? So yeah, there's really no mechanism for you legally to go after these people for falsehoods in stuff that they would say on the campaign trail.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very easy step, and I think it's the least we can do. I mean, to assume that voters can get one of those guides and they're going to go through and on their own fact check all these things is just ridiculous. Former State Representative Chad Mogendans, I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Brandy.